Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
I'm Dan Runde. I'm a Senior Vice President here at CSIS. I'm so pleased to have the Minister of the Economy of Brazil, Dr. Paulo Guedes. Brazil is one of the most important countries in the world. Unfortunately, I think the United States overlooks the importance of Brazil. If we want to solve the food crisis, we need Brazil. We want to solve the challenges around energy, whether it's clean energy or traditional energy, we're going to need Brazil. It's an enormous country with enormous potential. It's already a country with a great future, and it's with a really interesting present. I think there's a really interesting story to tell, and I think the minister is going to share some things that we haven't heard before in this conversation. And so I really appreciate him taking time out of his busy schedule. He's here for the spring meetings of the bank and fund. And so, Minister, tell us a little bit, how has Brazil weathered the COVID-19 pandemic? I think uniquely, I think it's done better than almost any other country in the world.
Well, the numbers show that we had a very efficient response economically, and we fully vaccinated 98% of the population.
So sorry, 98% of the population of Brazil is vaccinated?
Fully vaccinated, 2 doses, and 40% already with the 3rd doses. So
wow.
COVID is practically gone. The health minister just declared the pandemic became an epidemic.
And
it's like other.
It's like the flu or
yes,
something else.
Yes. So Brazil bounced back very strongly from the first shock. Our expenditures went from 19% of GDP to 26.5%, but they bounced back to 18.7%. So we are spending less now than the year before COVID.
It's amazing.
Unemployment went from 12% to 14.5%, is back to 11.1%. So it's lower now than when COVID came. We fully protected 68 million Brazilians. We digitalized every one of them, and we transferred income, $120 a month for 2 years in a row.
So using digital payments, so like a social safety net, digitally,
yes.
You're right, it's supporting them through a digital social safety net.
Yes, and Brazil, in the ranking of the World Bank, Brazil is #1 digital government in Americas, ahead of the US and Canada, and #7 in the world.
So e-government, you're the #7 in the world, and ahead of the United States and Canada.
Ahead of the US and Canada, exactly because we, during the pandemic, we really went digital. And Brazil was already, we elected our president through social networks. So Brazil is the 4th largest digital market in the world. And the pandemic kind of accelerated this jump into the digital age in Brazil.
Minister, I 100% agree with you. I think everywhere in the world there's been more e-government, digital payments, e-commerce, and distance learning in the last 102 weeks than in the last 102 years. And so you're an example of that.
And we preserved 11 million jobs through digital transfers to the companies. Instead of firing someone, just phone us. You reduce the labor shift by half. Instead of 8 hours work, 4 hours work, we pay the other half of the wage. So we preserved 11 million jobs in the formal market. We assist the most vulnerable ones. We bounced back. We dropped less and came back faster than many emerging economies. The IMF went to Brazil 2 years ago when pandemics hit Brazil in 2020. They forecast a drop of almost 10% on GDP. And they said advanced economies would go down 4%. Well, UK went down 9.7%. Italy went down more than 8%. France more than 7%. Germany 5.6%. Japan 4.5%, and Brazil 3.9%.
Wow.
We dropped it less. We bounced back very strongly, 4.5%. We removed all the fiscal incentives so that our deficit was 1% of GDP. It went to 10.5 in 2021, but is back to a small surplus. So we removed all the fiscal stimulus, all the monetary stimulus. We are quite behind. We're quite ahead of the curve. Federal Reserve is behind the curve. European Central Bank is behind the curve, and Brazil is already with a very high interest rates, and we probably will get out of inflation faster than the advanced economies.
It's incredible. This is not a story that's getting out.
No.
So I think it's important that we have this conversation. I wanna talk about several things. I've been a big proponent of having Brazil join the OECD. Matthias Cormann, who I think is an excellent leader of the OECD.
Wonderful.
A wonderful leader. And I was a big proponent of him becoming the leader of the OECD. I, in essence, largely helped support his campaign.
Congratulations.
Thank you, sir.
Congratulations.
Muito obrigado.
It's a great secretary, great general
De
secretary.
nada. So
Wonderful.
he's really excellent.
Yes.
But Minister, I also believe, and I have said for several years now, that the United States and other OECD countries should support Brazil join the OECD. OECD has made an open invitation to Peru, Argentina, and Brazil to join the OECD. Could you make the case for why Brazil should join the OECD and what are the benefits to Brazil?
The time is now. You are perfectly correct in your assessment, in your judgment of the situation. I've been with Matthias Cormann 2 weeks ago. That's why I'm so enthusiastic about it, because he understood, as a matter of fact, he understood quite earlier. 1 year ago, he was already anticipating the importance of bringing Brazil, India, Indonesia, all these guys that are preserving their natural resources, but didn't have an incentive to join the environmental agenda. So we were talking about how to build a three-pillar system, rewarding environmental services, at the same time stimulating innovation to go to a low-carbon economy, the transition to a low-carbon economy, and at the same time taxing pollution. So this three-pillar system that Matthias Cormann is heading at the OECD, the perfect timing is now, because they understood that Brazil is a key player for food security and for energy security of Europe. So we had a meeting there. They understood that the time is now for a session to OECD, and at the time to close the deal of Mercosur with the European Union. This was paralyzed since the Doha round 20 years ago. And then Brazil, as soon as President Bolsonaro took office, we went to Argentinians. We closed a Mercosur deal as a platform to close the European Union agreement with the Mercosur. And the time is now. Matthias Cormann and the ambassadors of the area,
of the OECD member countries.
Members, we talked to all of them. They understood that since Brazil is a key player, not only on the environmental agenda, but also on food security and energy security, the time is now for both agreements. One, Mercosur with European Union. Two, accession of Brazil to OECD, because then the tax will converge.
There'll be a convergence on tax rates.
Convergence on taxes, convergence on regulatory frameworks, so that we can receive investments from all the double tax agreements that we have to assess. So the Secretary Pascal, in charge of the fiscal and tax policies of the OECD, 1 week after our meetings in Europe, he went to Brazil. We are working very closely together, and we have news, interesting news that you probably are not informed about, because politics is kind of, as Brazilian democracy is very noisy. And after 30 years, 3 decades of social democrats in power, for the first time, there was an alliance of conservatives and liberals in the economy. so that the center right won the election. And so there's a lot of noise and information doesn't go through. You probably don't know that we collected already $30 billion in signing bonus for another $200 billion of investment commitments for the next 10 to 12 years. And gas, oil, sanitation, 5G telecommunications, electricity, cabotage. So foreign companies of all over the world are showing up systematically. Every 1 or 2 weeks, we are selling something. And they line up.
Privatizations.
Privatizations, concessions, authorizations. Want to build a railroad, you go there, you pay a signing bonus, and you then have the right to build it and to invest. Instead of auctionings, trying to raise most cash for the government, we are doing the other way around. You just pay the signing bonus, and we favor those who are committing to make most investments.
Minister, tell us about the future of Mercosur. You made some comments back in October of 2021 about the future of Mercosur. Paraguay, Uruguay, and Brazil have one vision of the future of Mercosur. Argentina has a different view. What will happen to the future? What will happen with Mercosur?
Well, I think Mercosur was the first platform for continental integration. It was before NAFTA. It was before the Eurozone. It was before the Asian Pacific Alliance. But it failed. It failed because we were trading, at the beginning of our government, we were trading 1/3 of what we used to trade with Argentina and the other partners of Mercosur 4 decades ago when we launched Mercosur. So as a ratio of GDP, we were trading less today than when we launched Mercosur, which means that the platform did not work. So we went back to the Argentinians, to Uruguayans and Paraguayans and said, either this thing is to launch us for a continental integration and agreements with European unity,
United States,
European Free Trade Area, either we integrate or it is of no use for us, the platform. So there was an agreement that we should go in this direction. That's why we subscribed the European Union agreement with Mercosur. We are still waiting for the decision. I think the time is now. I think the Europeans now understand the important and decisive role of the region for food security and energy security. And so I think we'll have news very soon.
Tell me about, I wanted you to tell a story. We were in the previous meeting, you talked about, you had visited with the government of France, and you talked about the level of trade with France in the year 2000 and the level of trade with China in the year 2000.
This is a very important fact. The growth axis of the world is changing. You still have political power, but economic power is changing hands. The emerging seven is BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa,
China.
and China. Emerging seven is these 5 countries of BRICS plus Indonesia and Mexico. So the 7 largest economies of the emerging group. So the GDP of emerging 7 is larger than the GDP of G7.
It's amazing.
So if you take the 7 largest advanced economies, their GDP is lower than the GDP of the emerging 7. So I was talking to the French and telling them, listen, year 2000, we used to trade less than $2 billion with France, less than $2 billion with China. 20 years later, 22 years later, now we are trading $120 billion with China and only $7 billion with France.
So in the year 2000, both were at $2 billion. Now it's $7 billion with France, and now it's $120 billion, 60 times greater.
That's it. Which means that
it's shocking.
It's shocking, and it means that if we don't do something now, which is exactly the European Union and Mercosur agreement which is exactly to move Brazil to a session on OECD, we are drifting in the other direction. We are being pulled by other directions.
You have other options.
We have other options. So we are selling more to the Middle East, to Southeast Asia, to China, than we used to Belgium, to France. And it is a very sad story, because what happens, demographics is not favorable to Europe. Demographically, the continent is shrinking. So it is of interest of the big companies in Europe to invest looking for new markets. You have 200 million consumers in Brazil. So the CAC 100, the 40 most important companies in France, they're making a lot of money in Brazil, a lot of profits in Brazil. They're investing down there. So European companies in general, the Spanish, the French, the Germans, they're investing in Brazil. And the governments did not understand that they have to accelerate this integration move.
Let me change subjects, Minister. Russia invaded Ukraine. What has been your government's position on that? Talk a little bit about that, because it has a number of implications for Brazil.
Okay. Well, from a geopolitical viewpoint, what happened? Brazil condemned the invasion of Ukraine by Russia.
Your president visited Putin in February.
The president was visiting Putin, and the timing was not proper. But the fact is that Brazil, in the Security Council of the United Nations, voted condemning Russia twice. And then in the General Assembly vote, Brazil again voted for the third time condemning the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So geopolitically, Brazil said a very sound and clear, loud and clear, no to the war and to invasion.
If there are sanctions imposed, will Brazil follow sanctions?
Then let's go to the sanctions. There would be no sanctions without the war. So sanctions are kind of a civilized response
to the war.
This is how it is politically. But the Constitution of Brazil prevents sanctions except those that the international community, through the United Nations,
endorses or supports.
So what happens? Brazil is in a very complex situation, which is we Brazilians consider war in the 21st century an absurd, a violence. It's not like a pandemic, which is a nature calamity.
A natural calamity.
It's
a man-made calamity.
It's a man-made calamity. It's a self-inflicted calamity to humanity. So, of course, Brazil condemns the war.
So Brazil condemns Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
We clearly condemned that. In the other side, at the same time, even though we understand that sanctions are a civilized response, because the uncivilized response is war against war.
Yes.
So if you invade us, we will invade you, and let's go to war. So a very civilized response is saying, listen, we will apply some sanctions. It's civilized. But our constitution is against economic sanctions, which are not underwritten by the United Nations. So Brazil we don't like the war, we don't like the sanctions.
Will Brazil be an enabler of Russia to skirt sanctions?
An enabler?
Of Russia to avoid sanctions?
Well, I wouldn't put it that way, that we will enable. Like I said, if you ask me my position, because Brazil is run by a president that has 60 million votes, and he's thinking of fertilizers that we import from Russia. He's thinking that, for instance, we don't belong to the club. We are not at OECD. So, and we belong to the BRICS. So we belong to the BRICS and we don't belong to OECD.
Okay.
So it's the only country in the BRICS that condemned the invasion. Half of the
Right,
world
India
population.
did not condemn it.
India and China,
Did
half
not
of the
condemn.
world population said,
Okay.
we don't care.
What-
So I think Brazil is in a complex situation,
But-
which is,
m- m-
if you ask me,
yes.
my answer would be ceasefire now, and then
Okay.
immediately lift sanctions.
Okay. So, Minister, you got received a letter from our Secretary of the Treasury asking for Brazil's support to, in essence, kick Russia out of the IMF and the World Bank. What is Brazil's position on this issue?
Our position is against the war, number one. As a consequence, we would like, since we are against the war, we are against the economic consequences of the war, which is the economic war,
Yeah.
which are sanctions. So Brazil is against the war and against the sanctions, including constitutionally against the sanctions. So we would vote for ceasefire immediately and lift sanctions. It is a very complex situation. What about the IMF? Kick them out of the IMF, kick them out of the multilateral
The World
institutions,
Bank or
the World Bank and so on. Well, same thing, by the statutes, by the
by the
rule
rules.
of law
Yeah.
and institutions, you cannot just
You can't
remove
just
a
kick
member.
them out.
You can't get them out. So instead of just cutting off the bridges, destroying the bridges, it is my personal viewpoint. It is personal. If you ask, what about Brazil in the IMF? Well, we support the rules of the IMF. And the rules say you can't keep them out. So we should talk about them. And we should the only reason why we should preserve the bridge is to convince them to cease fire. So if you kick them out, you are kind of stimulating the economic war. So this was the way we behaved previously. When after the war,
After World War II.
we began, we were very constructive and building bridges and loans and Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. After the World War I,
World War I.
yeah, as a matter of fact, we began escalating during the Great Depression.
Yeah, tariffs and.
Tariffs and protectionism, and it didn't work well.
Well, I think you'll find that
So
there's
being
a.
very, very clear about the answer, would you vote for expelling them from OECD, from
The World Bank
the
and
World
IMF?
Bank? Not expelling them. But
Okay.
why should they belong if they stay at war? So the question we should ask them is, listen, if you don't respect the institutions, if you don't behave properly, because we condemn the war and the invasion, why should you stay? We cannot remove you, but why should you stay if you don't behave properly?
Yes. Well, I think you're going to find that there's very strong views here in Washington about this, and I think it'll be interesting to see the response you get to that position. Food and energy. You're a major exporter of food and a major exporter of traditional energy and clean energy. How does Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there's huge disruptions in the energy markets, huge disruptions in food markets. There's been increasing interest in clean energy, including the need for minerals to enable the carbon transition. How does these changes in the disruption, including Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but the supply chain disruption, how is Brazil thinking about the food market, and how is Brazil thinking about energy markets?
Well, Brazil has been recognized as an emerging power on the food.
No question.
We are exporting all over the world.
You're a global food power.
Yes.
No question. Not an emerging one, if I may, Minister. I would say you're an emerged global food power.
The interesting thing now, as a side effect of this war, is that they discovered that Brazil is also an energy power. Because what happens? 65% of our matrix, energy matrix, is clean energy, is hydroelectric.
Really?
10% more is wind, and 5% is solar. So Brazil has practically 80% of clean energy.
Is your energy production clean?
Is really a low carbon energy producer. And then comes oil and fossils with 10%.
Fossil fuels, yeah.
Yes, fossil fuels. This is 10%. Natural gas, which is a transition
fuel.
So Brazil is very well positioned to face the crisis because we have an enormous variety. The Germans are renewing the nuclear programs with us.
Instead of working with Russia or others, they're working with you.
Yes. So we are beginning several of these alternatives where biofuel, nuclear, wind. For instance, our president is talking about building power of 50 Itaipus. Itaipu is the largest hydroelectric.
Build 50
plant.
more.
With wind.
Really?
One Itaipu is 10% of Brazil consumption.
Wow.
10%. So our president, talking to the specialists, is talking about building up to
the equivalent of 50 Itaipus of wind power to export electricity.
I'll be very moderate. I'll say only 10.
Okay.
Only 10. Only 10 is doubling our capacity.
That's the ability that would allow you
this
to.
could be done in 5 years.
And you could export that electricity.
And that export that we call it the green hydrogen, which is considered the energy of the future in liquid form. You could export it like oil.
Like LNG.
Like LNG.
So okay, Minister, I think my view is it is in the U.S. interest for Brazil to join the OECD. I would argue that for those who have challenges with your government, the OECD process is a way of having a structured, civilized negotiation with your government.
That is perfect.
To engage on a wide variety of issues.
Tax, investments, digital, environment.
Correct.
Everything.
So if you wanted to have a structured engagement with Brazil, the way to do it would be through the OECD process. I'm 100% on board with that.
Yeah.
Okay. I also think if we want to solve the carbon transition, we need Brazil because of your mineral wealth.
True.
If we want to solve the carbon transition because of your green energy, we need Brazil. If we want to solve the food challenges of the present and the future, we need Brazil. So why is it that your government has such a hard time at getting it? I don't understand. I know why, but why don't you tell me why you think it's been difficult to get the kind of engagement that I think we need to have with your country? Well,
from the very beginning, I said that our government was disrupting a very established social democrat
for 30 years.
Hegemony.
There had been a 30-year,
yeah. It was quite natural because if the military regime was considered rightist, it's natural that when you come back to democracy, the left prevails.
Yes.
So it was natural that they established some hegemony, political hegemony for 2-3 decades. But they have the same problem. Both of them were dirigists, interventionists. They believed in central planning.
These are the political parties that led Brazil over the 30 years.
So even the military, at the end of the military government, they built Eletrobras, Telebras, Sidebras, Nuclebras, Portobras, all the state complex. That was very useful for 2-3 decades. But
and you're in the process of you're privatizing them now.
Yes, we are privatizing all these things.
Minister, do you believe President Bolsonaro is going to win the re-election in the fall?
He goes everywhere in the country. He's acclaimed by thousands.
No one in Washington believes that your president's going to win, but I've seen some things that are very interesting. I think you've seen this as well, Minister. there's a political process in Brazil where the members of Congress have an ability once a year to switch political parties. A little bit of a foreign concept here in the United States.
Sure.
And if you assume that they're sophisticated political market actors,
Yes,
you
they're
saw that
proxies.
right, they're proxies, more members of Congress in Brazil switched to President Bolsonaro's side than those that were on the opposition in terms of their switching, which says something about their sense that they think Bolsonaro, they're going to want to be with the winner. Is that an interest? Is that the market signal that you look at, or do you look at polling? What do you look at?
Signs.
Yeah.
One of the signs is this massive move of the political constituents of the congressmen moving in the direction of the parties that support the president.
Yes.
This is one political proxy.
This is not something I've seen in the press that I saw
Yes.
someone share with me, and it was very called
important.
my attention.
And it's happening. In 2018, it was one man that won the election, alone, against everybody else.
President Bolsonaro.
President Bolsonaro. Less than $1 billion expenditures,
All social media.
all social media. He won alone.
He spent less than $1 million.
Less than $1 million.
Yeah.
So I was there, I talked to them, friends of mine, entrepreneurs offering money, he said, no, ask them to build signs in the roads,
Yeah.
just post things in favor of me, but I don't want to have close relations with anyone
Mhm.
because we'll be disrupting the establishment. So I don't have, I don't want to owe businessmen favors. Well, this was 2018. 2020, local elections all over the country. All political parties of the center and the right won the local elections. And all the left parties lost power. So some PT lost more than 1,000 mayors.
Wow.
PMDB, the other leftist party, lost 700 mayors. The other PSDB lost 300 mayors. So they lost a lot of power in the elections. And I think it's going to happen again. So center and right is going up, conservatives, and what we call, it's not the typical liberal American, it's liberal in the European sense.
European liberals.
It's the European liberal sense. The guys who, like Republicans,
Yeah.
who are in favor of
Free markets.
free
and-
markets.
Yeah.
So this political wind is going higher. And in 2018 was a wake-up call. In 2020, they confirmed
This movement.
this movement, and now they're going to really be massive winners in this.
So
election.
you believe that President Bolsonaro is going to win?
President Bolsonaro goes all over the country, and he's received by hundreds of millions.
Hundreds of.
And he gets out of security and embraces people and all over. And the other candidate can't go in the street.
Okay.
So I don't.
So
and the polls were giving like 20% advantage for the other candidate, then 15%, then 10%. Now it's 5%. So they have to converge to reality.
Okay, and there'll be a runoff. There's highly likely to be a second round in Brazilian election, and so there'll be an election between the two, probably. Okay. So let me give you a chance to have the last word, Minister. So make the case for why investors should invest in Brazil briefly.
Well, Brazil is really in transition from a state-driven economy, like I said, for the last two military governments, and then for 30 years with the Social Democrats,
Yes.
they've been, the military and the civilians, all of them have been raising corporate tax for 40 years, 4 decades, raising taxes, closing the economy, the excess of intervention of the government, corrupted the political system, and stagnated the economy. So we are going in the other direction. We are reducing taxes, opening the economy, integrating it to the global economy, making concessions, auctions, privatizing, decentralizing, enforcing a federal system instead of centrally planned economy. So we are doing everything that brought people to Brazil. Brazil is the largest colony of Japanese immigrants out of Japan.
How many Japanese live in 500,000?
Much more.
Several million.
Millions, some millions of descendants.
Really?
Yes. You have the largest colony of Japanese out of Japan.
In Brazil.
The second largest colony of Italians.
So the second largest descendants of Italians outside of Italy live in Brazil.
The third largest colony of Germans out of Germany.
Wow.
More Lebanese in Brazil than in Lebanon.
Really?
So Brazil used to bring people from all over the world. Brazil used
You're
to
a melting pot. You're a nation of migrants.
It's a melting pot, nation of migrants, and where people really culturally, they mixed up. Really culturally, they mixed up. It's the only country in the world where Muslims and Jewish, when you interview them and say, did you ever fight with that guy? He said, only in soccer games. So even when there was the Middle East war and everything, there was never
any problem.
Never any problem of that kind in Brazil. So Brazil used to be one of the fastest growing economy in the world. That's why it attracted all these people from all over the world after the Second World War. But then we stagnated. We collapsed, exactly like it happened with the Soviet Union. Exactly like it happened with Chile, exactly like it happened with Cuba.
Under Allende.
Under Allende,
Yeah.
Cuba, and now, well, you're seeing Argentina going the wrong way. We call it the road to misery. The road to misery. Venezuela is already there.
Hayek called it the road to serfdom.
That's perfect. Our program is called the road of misery, the road of prosperity. Exactly crossing two things.
Yeah.
Prosperity through competition, Ludwig Erhard,
Yeah.
the liberal that rebuilt Germany, and the road to serfdom of Hayek. So we got the road to prosperity. This is our business program.
Minister, I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. I think this was very informative. Thank you for being so generous with your time.
It was a pleasure, Daniel.
It's a privilege, Minister. Thank you so
We'll
much.
be together many times.
Thank you. Muito obrigado.
Obrigado.
Okay. Eric?